So the first thing about the Bible is that it's a comedy. And a comedy has a happy ending, right? So that's a strange thing because the Greek God stories were almost always tragic. Now, the Bible is a comedy. It has a happy ending. Everyone lives. There's a heaven. So now, what you think about that is a completely different issue. I'm just telling you the structure of the story. It's something like there was paradise at the beginning of time, and then some cataclysm occurred and people fell into history, and history is limitation and mortality and suffering and self-consciousness. But there's a mode of being, or potentially the establishment of a state, that will transcend that. And that's what time is aiming at. So that's the idea of the story. Now, it's a funny thing that the Bible has a story because it wasn't written as a book, right? It was assembled from a whole bunch of different books. And the fact that it got assembled into something resembling a story is quite remarkable. And what the question is then, well, what is that story about? And how did it come up as a story? And then I suppose as well, is there anything to it? It constitutes a dramatic record of self-realization or abstraction. We already mentioned that. It's like the idea, for example, of the formulation of the, let's say, the image of God is an abstraction. That's how we're going to handle it to begin with. I want to say, though, because I said I wasn't going to be any more reductionist than necessary, I know that the evidence for genuine religious experience is incontrovertible, but it's not explicable. And so I don't want to explain it away. I want to just leave it as a fact. And then I want to pull back from that and say, okay, well, we'll leave that as a fact and a mystery, but we'll look at this, we're going to look at this from a rational perspective and say that the initial formulation of the idea of God was an attempt to abstract out the ideal and to consider it as an abstraction outside its instantiation. So, and that's good enough. That's an amazing thing if it's true. But I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, let's say. It's a collection of books with multiple redactors and editors. So what does that mean? Many people wrote it. There's many different books, and they're interwoven together, especially in the first 5 books, by people who, I suspect, took the traditions of tribes that had been brought together under a single political organization and tried to make their accounts coherent. And so they took a little of this, and they took a little of that, and they took a little of this, and they tried not to lose anything because it seemed valuable, or it was certainly valuable to the people who had collected the stories. They weren't going to, tolerate too much editing. But they also wanted it to make sense to some degree, so it wasn't completely logically contradictory and completely absurd. And so many people wrote it, and many people edited it, and many people assembled it over a vast stretch of time. And we have very few documents like that. And so just because we have a document like that is sufficient reason to look at it as a remarkable phenomena and try to understand what it is that it's trying to communicate, let's say. And then I said it's also the world's first hyperlinked text, which is that again, and very much worth thinking about for quite a long time. All right, there's 4 sources in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. 4 stories that we know came together. One was called the priestly. There's a source called the priestly, and it used the name Elohim or El Shaddai for God. And I believe El is the root word for Ella as well. So, and that's usually translated as God or the gods, because Elohim is utilized as plural in the beginning books of the Bible. And it's newer than the Yahwist version. Now, the reason I'm telling you that is because Genesis 1, which is the first story, isn't as old as Genesis 2. Genesis 2 contains, the Yahwist version contains the story, for example, of Adam and Eve. And that's older than the very first book in the Bible. But they decided to put the newer version first, and well, it isn't, and I think it's because it deals with more fundamental abstractions. It's something like that. It's like it deals with the most basic of abstractions, how the universe was created, and then segues into what the human environment is like. And so that seems to be the logic behind it. The Yahwist version uses the name YHWH, which apparently people didn't say, but we believe was pronounced something like Yahweh. And it has a strongly anthropomorphic God, so one that takes human form. It begins with Genesis 2:4. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when and it contains the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Noah and the Tower of Babel and Exodus and Numbers, along with the priestly version. It also contains the law in the form, just the form of the Ten Commandments, which is like a truncated form of the law. There's the Elohist source. It contains the stories of Abraham and Isaac. It's concerned with a heavenly hierarchy that includes angels. It talks about the departure from Egypt, and it presents the covenant code, which is this idea of that, that society is predicated. This was Israeli society. It was predicated on a covenant with God, and that's laid out in a sequence of rules, some of which are the Ten Commandments, but many of which are much more extensive than that. And then the final one is the Deuteronomist code, and it contains the bulk of the law and what's called the Deuteronomic history, and it's independent of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And so we know that at least now there's debate about this like there is about everything, so I'm brushing over a very large area of scholarship, but people generally assume that there were multiple authors over multiple periods of time, and the way they've concluded that is by looking at textual analysis, trying to see where there are chunks of the stories that have the same kind of style or the same reference. And people argue about that because, obviously it's difficult to recreate something ancient, but that's the basic idea. So it is an amalgam of viewpoints about these initial issues, and that's important to know. So it's like it's a collective story. And okay, now to understand the first part of Genesis, I'm going to turn, strangely enough, to something that's actually part of the New Testament, and this is a central element of Christianity. And it's a very strange idea, and it's going to take a very long time to unpack, but the idea, this is what John said about Christ. He said, in the beginning was the Word, and so that relates back to Genesis 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Three sentences like that take a lot of unpacking because, well, none of that seems to make any sense whatsoever, really, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was both with God, and the Word was God. So the first question might be, what in the world does that mean? In the beginning was the Word. That's the Logos, actually. And the Logos is embodied in the figure of Christ. So there's this idea in John that whatever Christ is, the Son of God, is not only instantiated in history, say at a particular time and place as a carpenter in some backwoods part of the world, but also something eternal that exists up outside of time and space that was there right at the beginning. And as far as I can tell, what that Logos represents is something like modern people. It's something like what modern people refer to when they talk about consciousness. It's something like that. It's more than that. It's like consciousness and its capacity to be aware and its capacity to communicate. It's something like that. And there's an idea underneath that, which is that being, especially from a phenomenological perspective, so the being that is experience cannot exist without consciousness. It's like consciousness shines a light on things to bring it into being. Because without consciousness, what is there? No one experiences anything. It's like, is there anything when no one experiences anything? That's the question. And the answer that this book is presenting is that, no, you have to think about consciousness as a constituent element of reality. It's something that's necessary for reality itself to exist. Now, of course, it depends on what you mean by reality. But the reality that's being referred to here, I told you already, is this strange amalgam of the subjective experience and the world. But the question is deeper than that, too, because it is by no means obvious what there is if there's no one to experience it. I mean, the whole notion of time itself seems to collapse, at least in terms of something like felt duration, and the notion of size disappears essentially because there's nothing to scale it, and the causality seems to vanish. And so, and we don't understand consciousness, not in the least. We don't understand what it is that is in us that gives illumination to being. And what happens in the Old Testament, at least in part, is that that consciousness is associated with the divine. Now you think, well, is that a reasonable proposition? And that's a very complicated question, but at least we might note that there's something to the claim, because there is a miracle of experience and existence that's dependent on consciousness. I mean, people try to explain it away constantly, but it doesn't seem to work very well. And here's something else to think about, I think, that's really worth thinking about. People do not like it when you treat them like they're not conscious, right? They react very badly to that. And then you don't like it if someone assumes that you're not conscious, and you don't like it if someone assumes that you don't have free will, you know, that you're just absolutely determined in your actions, and there's nothing that's going to repair you, and that you don't need to have any responsibility for your actions. It's like our culture, the laws of our culture are predicated on the idea, something like people are conscious, people have experience, people make decisions and can be held responsible for them, that there's a free will element to it. And you can debate all that philosophically, and fine, but the point is that that is how we act, and that is the idea that our legal system is predicated on. And there's something deep about it because, you know, you're subject to the law, but the law is also limited by you, which is to say that in a well-functioning, properly grounded democratic system, you have intrinsic value. That's the source of your rights. Even if you're a murderer, we have to say, the law can only go so far because there's something about you that's divine. Well, what does that mean? Well, partly it means that there's something about you that's conscious and capable of communicating, like you're a whole world unto yourself. And you have that to contribute to everyone else, and that's valuable. I mean, that you can learn new things, you can transform the structure of society, you can invent a new way of dealing with the world. You're capable of all that. It's an intrinsic part of you, and that's associated with this. It's associated, that's the idea there, is that there's something about the logos that is necessary for the absolute chaos of the reality beyond experience to manifest itself as reality. It's an amazing idea because it gives consciousness a constitutive role in the cosmos.